هذا الشعب يشوفنا.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us again for another episode in the podcast, The EU's Relations with the Middle East. In today's episode, I'm excited to host two very important people, Ila and Eilon. Say hello, Ila and Eilon.
Hey everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us today. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the EU's relations with Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. So we'll start with you, Eilon. Tell us about the history of Libya.
So, Libya is a vast land covering 1.7 million square kilometers, most of which is desert. Throughout its history, it's been occupied by many forces, such as the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, and the Italians. Before the country struck black gold, it was one of the poorest nations in the world. It had always been a country of sharp contrasts on the regional, tribal, ethnic, and religious levels. Today, many of the tribal distinctions are gone, but other contrasts remain, and they are crucial to you understanding the Libyan country. Given that Libya has been one of the only places to have escaped the European colonial advances at the time, they were an obvious target for Rome's new colonial ambitions. Italy began establishing economic presence in Libya and investing in many industries. In 1919, Italy issued the Legge Fondamentale, laws under which the Libyan provinces were granted their own parliaments and governing council. Idris al-Susani, head of the Susani order since 1916, held the position of Emir of Cyrenaica, establishing him as the administrator of several oases autonomously. Following the Allied powers' victory over Germany and Italy in World War II, it was all over for the Axis powers in North Africa. The Italians were forced to retreat, at last freeing Libya from its colonial masters. In December of 1951, the newly installed King Idris proudly proclaims from Libya's palace the independence of the Libyan country. The challenges at independence were immense. The Italians left the country with a population that was, for most of its part, uneducated. There was almost no professional class in the form of doctors and teachers, which means that not only lacked the professional class to advance the country, they were also lacking in the administrative know-how, as Libyans had been excluded from the Italian colonial administrative offices. With the discovery of large reserves of oil in 1959 by foreign energy companies, many of them rushed to the country in search of this black gold. The country had to get its act fast. The oil wealth was also created a new class of rich that cut across tribal links and that began the change of the social fabric of the Libyan society. King Idris' greatest challenge turned out to be dealing with the tide of Arab nationalism that gripped the Arab world during the 1950s and 60s. Nationalist ideas entered the country with hundreds of Egyptian, Palestinian, and Sudanese teachers who have been brought in to the staffs of Libya's schools and universities on account of the lack of qualified locals.
Eilon, thank you so much for this fascinating history of the Libyan nation. I want to talk a little bit about Gaddafi's rise to power. Muammar Gaddafi was born in 1942 to an Arab Bedouin tribe from a small rural town in the deserts of Tripolitania. He was encouraged by his father, who sponsored his studies that weren't free in Libya, to be proud of his Bedouin heritage. Although being bullied in school for being a Bedouin and having to sleep in a mosque in the town of Sirte and traveling 32 kilometers on the weekends to visit his family, he was taking his studies very seriously. Gaddafi was educated by Islamic scholars and later on by Egyptians that influenced his perception of the world and shaped his beliefs to be supportive of Arab nationalism. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's president, was Gaddafi's hero and inspired him to reject Western colonialism and to initiate a coup d'etat. Gaddafi and his family were expelled by the authorities, for Gaddafi's part in organizing demonstrations against the monarchy. He joined the military and used the opportunity it offered as the only way for an upward social mobility for underprivileged Libyans like himself, and as a tool of political influence. Gaddafi's Free Officers secret cell, influenced by Nasser's Egyptian Free Officers, started with Operation Jerusalem on September 1st, 1969, to overthrow the Libyan monarchical leader Mohammed Idris. The country fell quickly and with minimal bloodshed, and the establishment of the Libyan Arab Republic, of which Gaddafi controlled until his assassination in 2011, was completed. Gaddafi's third international theory was the style of governance on which his government was officially based. It was inspired by Islamic socialism and was proposed by Gaddafi as an alternative to capitalism and Marxism, who had been proven invalid in Libya. Dominating Libya's politics for 4 decades as an absolute leader, Gaddafi's developed a cult of personality around his figure, something that characterized his rule in the country. And from learning about the history of Muammar Gaddafi, we want to go to Ilah to tell us a little bit about the EU's relations with Gaddafi.
Thank you, Val. Okay, so I'm going to talk about those relations. And to start with, I want to say that in decades before the UN has started, each state had its own relations with Gaddafi's Libya. For example, Berlin, the USA was in a different kind of relationship than Italy. Berlin had struggles with Libya, and Italy was in kind of a good relationship with them. So in the 2000, there was an increase in the relation. It's called the Libya model, and it stated the way that countries and relations between states could become good and could become in a good state, in a good position. Although before it was really in a bad shape and was struggling to condemn good relationships between them. So, for example, there was the agreement with Italy of Berlusconi. The agreement has touched on the way Italy will help Libya. In exchange for that, Italy will help Libya in the things that she needs, like water or something like that. And this was in the beginning of the 2000s. The Arab Spring has changed the picture. It caused to a withdrawal of all Europe diplomatic relations. So they have noticed all the change that's happening and the way that all the revolution wanted to take Gaddafi off power, and it began with the withdrawal of the diplomatic relations. And it's gotten worse with the sanctions on Gaddafi's Libya. So it means that the EU itself had sanctions on it for him to resign. And after they commit execution of Gaddafi, the official comment of the EU was really like blessing for it and was happy on the change that's happening and on the power that the revolution got from his execution.
Thank you, Ilah, for this information. And I heard you mention the Arab Spring. And thankfully, we have an Arab Spring expert here in the studio. So, Elon, tell us more about the Arab Spring and Libya.
So, yeah, Hila did mention the Arab Spring, which had huge impact on the Libyan modern history. So let's analyze how that came to be. So in the year of 2010, a series of violent protests ignited the Arab Spring, a series of protests and altercations between the oppressed people of different Arab countries and the anti-democratic regimes in countries such as the country we were speaking of, Libya, Egypt, and Morocco. These protests will not only shake the Middle East in particular, but the entire Islamic world. In Libya, these protests began in the city of Benghazi, in which the security forces fired against a crowd of heterogeneous rebel groups, such as those clans Gaddafi had prosecuted. The International Committee decided to support the rebels. For example, the National Transitional Council was supported by the British and French air forces, or by supplying the insurgent powers with weapons. The Libyan leadership split into two governments, one based on a secular matrix recognized internationally, assisted by Egypt and the UAE in the name of anti-Islamist ideology, the other Islamic, headquartered in Tripoli with international support of Qatar, Sudan, and Turkey, based on different interests, such as earning prominent place in the global political scene or supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. In Libya, in addition to the two governments, our forces are simultaneously at work, trying to fill the power vacuum caused by the fall of Gaddafi, such as, for example, Salafist groups and terrorist cells.
Thank you, Elon. That was fascinating. And I would like to tell you guys about NATO's operation in Libya. Operation Unified Protector started on 19 March 2011. A multi-state NATO-led coalition began a military intervention in Libya to implement United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973 concerning the Libyan civil war that was adopted 2 days earlier on 17 March 2011. This resolution, in response to events during the first Libyan civil war of 2011, in the context of the Arab Spring you were just mentioning, was the UN Security Council's intent to bring an immediate ceasefire in Libya, including an end to the current attacks against civilians, which it said might constitute crimes against humanity. The resolution authorized NATO to implement an arms embargo and no-fly zone and to protect Libyan civilians and civilian-populated areas. The operation began with a naval arms embargo. On 19 March 2011, France intervened in the imminent Second Battle of Benghazi, while attacking Libyan air defense systems, forcing Gaddafi's troops and armor back with airstrikes. On the same day, Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from UK and US ships, as well as executing further airstrikes against ground targets. A ban on all flights in the country's airspace was implemented by the Allies, making Libya into a no-fly zone. After Gaddafi's death on 20 October 2011, of which the CIA was claimed to have connections to, the NATO mission ended on 31st October. The aftermath of the operation was a Gaddafi-free and a failed state Libya. Critics described the military intervention as disastrous and accused it of destabilizing the country and the region, leading to the rise of Islamic extremist groups in the region, escalating the violence into the Second Libyan Civil War of 2014. Libya has become the main exit for migrants trying to get to Europe in what is known as the 2015 European migrant crisis. In the movie, we were required to watch the invasion of Lampedusa of 2011. We could get a sense of such a crisis, and that was thanks to the course we all took in Ben-Gurion University. And now I would like to know more about the Libyan refugee crisis and the EU.
Today's Libya is plagued with a civil war and terrorism acts that leads to migrants escaping from the country. Waves of conflict outside and inside its border have produced subsequent waves of refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people. These IDPs make the majority of those requiring humanitarian aid in today's Libya. Asylum seekers and migrants also find themselves in need of humanitarian aid in Libya, as the European funds have been allocated to strengthen the incarceration and prevention of migrants from ever reaching European shores. Many find themselves in endless loop, held in detention camps where the odds of being subjected to abuse and other forms of violence are unfortunately high. The European Union must stop helping to return people to the hellish conditions in Libya. Men, women, and children are returned to Libya to face arbitrary detention, torture, sexual violence, and unlawful killings. In 2021, Libyan Coast Guard, supported by Italy and the EU, captured thousands of refugees and migrants at sea and returned them to Libya. During the year, many of them died or disappeared at sea in the central Mediterranean. Despite knowledge of this, an internal report by the commander of the EU naval operation confirmed plans to continue capacity building programs for Libyan Coast Guard. EU leaders' cooperation with the Libyan authorities is keeping desperate people trapped in an unimaginable horrors in Libya. Over the past 5 years, Italy, Malta, and the EU have helped to capture tens of thousands of women, men, and children at sea, many of whom ended up in horrific detention centers full of torture, while countless others were forcibly disappeared.
Wow, Elon, that's really, really horrifying to hear. And to end up with, I would like Hila to tell us about the EU relations with Libya today.
I would love to. Okay, so I want to say that the EU relations with Libya today is not very good. Libya's case is like a mirror to the EU struggle. It shows how they can't really create something that's really one line of relations with other states. Every state looked at her own interests and tried to create the relations incorporate into those interests. So Italy, for example, she really wants the refugees to be out of Italy, and she tries to create a good relations with Libya for that case. The government in Libya today is really collapsing. They're searching for allies around the world, in the EU, and not really making those good allies. And that leads to relations with states that the EU doesn't want that Libya had relations with, like Turkey. The Libyan and Turkish agreement is really scary for the EU and making them worry because they're afraid of them creating a good relations, and that will hurt the EU's interest. Also because of the country itself and the way that they can get their own interest, each of the EU states, and also because of the relations that again collapse the relations between Turkey and the EU, and that will hurt them. So the struggle of Libya to create a good ally is concerning for the EU, and that's not stating a good place of the relationships today. So we'll hope for something better.
Thank you very much, Hila, and thank you, Elon. This was a fascinating episode of our podcast, The EU's Relations in the Middle East. And again, it's not obvious to get two of your experts' time. So thank you, Hila. Thank you, Elon. Say goodbye to our listeners.
Thank you so much for listening. We're hoping.
Thank you. Yeah.
And thank you for joining us to this podcast. Hope to see you in the next episode. Goodbye.